You and your fellow players are witches who have come upon the medieval village of Wickersby. You will send out your familiars to the village locations to gather ingredients, which you will use to cast spells, complete your witches' schemes, and be declared the Village Crone. The board is made up of 6 modular pieces that can be arranged in any pattern, as long as the grid lines are aligned. The more grid lines touching between the pieces, the easier players will be able to move around the board. Villagers are placed in their home locations. The farmer in the farm, the peasant in the village green, the lord in the lord's manor, the priest in the tithe barn, the miller in the mill, and the blacksmith in the forge. 3 Eye of Newt cards are shuffled into each of the 4 ingredient types, and the ingredients are then placed in their locations. The soil in the farm, the silver in the lord's manor, the flour in the mill, and the fire in the forge. Each player then chooses a book of spells and the corresponding familiars. The spells in each book are the same. Selection is based on the witch and familiars the player prefers. Each player is then dealt 1 of each of the 3 levels of Witch's Scheme cards. The level indicates the difficulty of the card, as well as the number of points you score by completing it. The winner will be the first player to score 13 points. Set the remaining Witch's Scheme cards, the frogs, the love tokens, and the binding rings next to the board. The player with the birthday closest to Halloween, without going past, is given the broom and starts the game as the first player. Every player places 1 familiar in the village green. Then, proceeding clockwise in turn order, each player places 1 familiar in any location until a total of 3 familiars per player is on the board. As the players place familiars, 2 ingredients are drawn from the locations. Familiars in the mill yield flour. Familiars in the farm yield soil. Those in the lord's manor yield silver. And those in the forge yield fire. Familiars in the village green yield nothing. And familiars in the tithe barn prevent players from having to tithe, which will be discussed in detail. The 2 extra familiars remain next to each player's book of spells. The first step in the order of play is to tithe. As soon as each player knows which ingredient he or she wants to tithe, he or she places that ingredient face down in the tithe barn. This does not have to be done in turn order. Remember, if you have a familiar in the tithe barn, you can skip this step. The second step in the order of play is to move and cast spells. In turn order, every player may move any of his or her familiars and/or any villagers up to 6 spaces total and cast as many spells as they have ingredients for. Elspeth is using 2 fire to cast the love spell on the blacksmith and the miller and complete Strike the Blacksmith. Her score is now 1. Moving and casting spells can be done in any order, even interchangeably. Note that spells that cause villagers to change location do not count against the 6 movements a player may use per turn. After a player has completed all movement and spell casting, he or she draws the top card from each Witch's Scheme deck. The player looks at all 3 and chooses 1 for every scheme completed in the move and cast spells phase. In this case, Elspeth chooses 1. The other 2 are returned to the tops of their decks. If Elspeth can remember these cards when other players draw them, she will have an advantage in player knowledge. The third step in the order of play is to harvest. After all players have moved their cast spells, every player draws 2 ingredients for each of their familiars in a location. This does not need to be in turn order. If you draw an Eye of Newt, that card can be used as any ingredient. Think of it as a wild card. If you have no familiars in any locations with ingredients, you may draw 2 ingredients from the top of the Tithe barn. The last step in the order of play is to move the Broom. The Broom indicates the first player to move and cast spells in the order of play, and is moved clockwise at the end of each round. The game ends when a player scores 13 points, and everyone has had his or her turn on the final move and cast spells phase, and has harvested. In this case, Sorka has won. If there is a tie, the player with the lowest number of completed Witch's Scheme cards wins. If there is a tie for points, and for the number of completed Witch's Scheme cards, the win goes to the player with the highest number of ingredients in hand at the end of the game. For deeper explanations, see our videos on movement and scattering, casting spells, and Witch's Scheme cards. And best of luck as you contend to become the Village Crone.